I never thought I'd find myself in such a situation. It was a quiet Sunday morning, and I had just stepped out of the shower, the bathroom still steamy, my hair dripping wet. I was still half asleep, lost in thought, as I wiped the fog off the mirror and reached for my towel. My mind was on autopilot, thinking about how I'd spend the rest of my lazy weekend when the bathroom door suddenly creaked open behind me. At first, I thought it was my mom, forgetting I was in there. We've had a few awkward moments when she'd barged in, needing something from the bathroom cabinet, so I wasn't alarmed. But as I turned, towel clutched around my waist, I realized it wasn't her. Standing in the doorway was my stepdad, Jeff, and he was just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. I froze, my eyes wide, and so did he. For a few seconds, we just stared at each other, and it felt like time had stopped. I'd never seen him like this, his normally confident demeanor replaced by a momentary loss of words. Jeff was tall, with broad shoulders and a rugged, masculine face. He was the kind of man who always seemed to have everything under control, a presence that was hard to ignore. Right now, though, he looked unsure, almost vulnerable, and it threw me off balance. Sorry, he said, his voice softer than usual, almost a whisper, but he didn't look away. His eyes roamed over me, lingering on my bare chest, then moving down to my towel-covered hips before quickly snapping back up to my face. It was like he was seeing me for the first time, really seeing me, and I felt exposed, not just physically, but in a way that made my heart race. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the awkward silence, but my mind was a mess. What was he doing here? Why hadn't he looked away yet? And why did I feel this weird fluttering in my stomach? It was my stepdad, for God's sake. He married my mom 2 years ago, and since then, he'd been nothing but polite and respectful. We weren't close, but we got along well enough. He was the guy who fixed things around the house, mowed the lawn, and sometimes grilled burgers on the weekends. I'd always thought he was good-looking, tall, fit, with that rugged, dad-next-door charm, but I'd never let myself think of him in any other way, until now. I thought you were at work, I finally managed to say, my voice shaky. I tightened my grip on the towel, trying to cover myself up, but it didn't feel like enough. I'm almost done. He hesitated, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite read. It was like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the right words. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he snapped out of it. Right. Sorry, he muttered, taking a step back. I'll let you finish. He turned to leave, but before he could close the door, he glanced back at me, and I saw that look again. Curious, intense, like he was trying to figure something out. It sent a shiver down my spine, and then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what had just happened, but I could feel that something between us had shifted. I stood there, staring at the closed door, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? Maybe he was just embarrassed and didn't know how to act, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was something in the way he'd looked at me, a kind of hesitation, as if he was seeing me in a way he'd never seen me before. It was confusing and a little scary, but also thrilling in a way I couldn't explain. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about that moment. Every time I heard his voice, every time he walked past me in the house, I felt my cheeks flush, and my mind would flash back to the way he'd looked at me in the bathroom. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just overthinking it, but the more I tried to push it away, the more it consumed me. That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over in my head. I couldn't understand why I was so fixated on it. It wasn't like anything actually happened. He'd just walked in by accident, right? But then, why did it feel like it meant something? Why did I keep imagining what would have happened if he hadn't walked out, if he'd stayed, if he'd said whatever it was he wanted to say? I tried to shake the thoughts away, but they kept coming back, filling my mind with scenarios I knew were wrong, but couldn't stop thinking about. What was wrong with me? I was feeling things I shouldn't feel, thinking things I shouldn't think, and it was driving me crazy. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to act like everything was normal. I went downstairs expecting to find Jeff already out in the yard or working on something in the garage, but instead, he was in the kitchen making coffee. He looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, our eyes met. There it was again, that same look, intense and searching, like he was trying to figure me out. I quickly looked away, pretending to be busy getting my breakfast, but I could feel his gaze on me, and it made my skin tingle. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, like nothing had happened, but there was a slight edge to it, a hint of tension that hadn't been there before. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound equally casual. I poured myself a bowl of cereal, my hands shaking slightly. I wanted to ask him why he'd come into the bathroom yesterday, but I didn't know how to bring it up without making things awkward. So I kept quiet, hoping he'd say something, anything, to break the tension that was building between us. But he didn't. We ate breakfast in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. And the more we didn't talk about it, the more it felt like a secret, something just between us. I could feel it, this invisible thread pulling us closer, and I didn't know whether to be scared or excited. For the next few days, we tiptoed around each other, pretending everything was normal. But it wasn't. I could feel the tension every time we were in the same room, and I knew he felt it too. It was like we were playing a game, a dangerous game, where neither of us wanted to make the first move, but both of us were waiting for something to happen. And as much as I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things, deep down, I knew the truth. Something had changed between us, and I didn't know if it was the beginning of something beautiful or the start of a disaster. All I knew was that I couldn't stop thinking about him, and every time I saw him, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall. After that morning, everything changed between Jeff and me. It was subtle at first, a shift that I thought might pass, but it only grew stronger. I found myself looking for excuses to be around him, lingering in the kitchen when he was making coffee, or sitting out on the porch when I knew he'd be outside. And every time I did, I'd catch him watching me, his eyes lingering just a little too long, his gaze warmer than it had ever been. I should have felt guilty. He was my stepdad, my mom's husband, and I knew this was wrong, but the way he looked at me, the way his eyes seemed to darken whenever I was near, made it impossible for me to stay away. It was like a magnet, pulling me closer, even though I knew I was playing with fire. One evening, my mom had to leave for a work trip, leaving Jeff and me alone for the weekend. I knew things might get tense, so I tried to keep myself busy, but there was only so much I could do to avoid him. That night, as I was heading to bed, I heard a knock on my door. I opened it to find Jeff standing there, looking nervous, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Can we talk?" My heart started pounding. Sure," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He walked in, but instead of sitting down, he stayed by the door, his eyes searching mine. I could tell something was bothering him, but I didn't dare ask. "I know things have been weird between us lately," he started, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I don't want you to feel uncomfortable in your own home." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to agree, to tell him that it was all in my head, that nothing had changed. But the other part of me, the part that had been craving his attention, longing for him to look at me the way he did, wanted to hear him admit that he felt the same way. "I haven't been uncomfortable," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. "I mean, it's been different, yeah, but not in a bad way." He looked at me, his expression softening. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, trying to gather my courage. "I don't know. It's just, I've been thinking about you a lot lately." He didn't say anything, but I could see his jaw tighten, his eyes darkening as he took a step closer. "I've been thinking about you too," he confessed. And there it was, the unspoken truth between us, finally out in the open. more than I should, and I don't know how to stop. The air between us felt electric, charged with all the things we hadn't said. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't know what to do, what to say, so I just stood there, staring at him, waiting. And then he took another step forward, closing the distance between us. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before brushing a strand of hair away from my forehead. His touch was gentle, almost tentative, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted more, needed more, but I was too scared to make the first move. He must have seen the hesitation in my eyes because he leaned in, his lips inches from mine. "If this is too much, tell me to stop," he whispered, his breath warm against my skin. I didn't want him to stop. I didn't want to pretend anymore. So I closed the gap between us, pressing my lips against his. The kiss was soft at first, almost cautious, like we were both testing the waters, afraid of what might happen if we gave in. But as soon as I felt his mouth on mine, all the doubt, all the hesitation melted away. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss until it was hard and urgent, full of all the things we hadn't been able to say out loud. His hands slid down my back, tracing the curve of my spine before settling on my hips. He pulled me against him, and I could feel how much he wanted me, how badly he'd been holding back. It made me dizzy, the thought that he desired me, that he was willing to risk everything for this, for me. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together. "I shouldn't be doing this," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "This is wrong." "I don't care," I said, my voice more certain than it had ever been. "I want you." For a moment, he just stared at me, his eyes searching mine as if trying to find some hint of doubt. But there was none. I wanted him, and I was willing to take the risk. Consequences be damned. That night, we didn't just kiss. We explored each other, our hands wandering, touching, learning. I'd never felt anything like it before, the way his hands moved over my skin, rough and tender all at once. He touched me in ways that made my head spin, his fingers tracing every inch of me, like he was memorizing my body, learning every curve, every scar. It was intoxicating the way he made me feel, like I was the only person in the world that mattered. We spent the night in his room, our bodies tangled together, whispering things we couldn't say in the daylight. It wasn't just about lust. There was something deeper, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing until that moment. The way he looked at me, the way he held me, made me feel seen, understood, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. As the hours passed, our touches grew bolder, more desperate, as if we were trying to make up for all the time we'd lost. We kissed until our lips were sore, and even then we didn't stop. His hands were everywhere, exploring, teasing, making me gasp and moan in ways I'd never imagined. It was past midnight when we finally lay down, our limbs tangled, his arms wrapped around me. I could feel his heart beating against my back, steady and strong, and for the first time in a long time, I felt safe. I wanted to stay like that forever, to forget about everything else, to just exist in that moment with him. But as I lay there, listening to the sound of his breathing, reality started to creep back in. What were we doing? How were we going to keep this a secret? My mom would be back in a few days and everything would go back to normal. Or at least it was supposed to. But I knew deep down that things would never be the same. We'd crossed a line and there was no going back. I turned to look at him, his face soft in the moonlight, and felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't fair to him, or to my mom, but when he opened his eyes and smiled at me, all my doubts disappeared. He made me feel alive, made me feel like I was more than just the quiet kid who kept to himself, and I wasn't ready to let that go. As I drifted off to sleep, my head resting on his chest, I knew that this was only the beginning. We were playing with fire, and it was only a matter of time. But I didn't care. I wanted him, needed him, and for now, that was all that mattered. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions, secrets, and stolen moments. My mom's work trip meant Jeff and I had the house to ourselves, and we took full advantage of it. Every chance we got, we would sneak off, find some quiet corner of the house, and get lost in each other. It was like we were making up for lost time, cramming every ounce of passion and desire we had into those fleeting moments, knowing they would end too soon. In the mornings, we'd steal kisses in the kitchen, barely able to keep our hands off each other. In the afternoons, when the house was quiet, we'd disappear into his room, our clothes left in a trail behind us. We couldn't get enough of each other, and every touch, every kiss felt electric, like we were setting the world on fire. But as much as I wanted to stay lost in this fantasy, reality was always there, lurking in the background. I knew my mom would be back soon, and I didn't know what would happen then. We hadn't talked about it, hadn't even dared to think about it. But as the days passed, it became harder and harder to ignore. On her last night away, Jeff and I sat out on the porch, the night air cool against our skin. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly, and for a moment it felt like everything was perfect. We didn't say much, we didn't need to. Just being there, side by side, our fingers entwined, was enough. But as I looked at him, I could see the worry in his eyes, the lines on his forehead deeper than usual. He was thinking about it too, and it scared me. I didn't want to lose him, didn't want this to end. But I also knew we couldn't keep going like this, sneaking around behind my mom's back, pretending everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. "I don't want this to end," I said, breaking the silence. My voice was barely a whisper, but in the quiet of the night it felt loud. He turned to look at me, his eyes soft and sad. "Neither do I," he said, squeezing my hand. "But we can't keep doing this, can we?" I felt a lump form in my throat. I knew he was right, but I didn't want to admit it. "What if we didn't have to hide?" I asked, my heart pounding. "What if we told her?" He stared at me, his eyes widening in shock. "You're serious?" I nodded, even though my hands were shaking. "I don't want to lie anymore. I love you, Jeff." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I thought I'd said too much. But then he reached out, cupping my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears I hadn't realized were falling. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I should, but telling her, it would destroy everything." I knew he was right. My mom would never understand, would never forgive us, but I didn't want to think about that. I just wanted him, and I was willing to do whatever it took to keep him. "Then let's just run away," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "We can go somewhere, start over, just you and me." He looked at me like I'd just said the craziest thing he'd ever heard. But then, slowly, he smiled, and I could see the hope in his eyes. "You'd really do that? Leave everything behind?" "For you, yes," I said without hesitation. "I don't care about anything else." And for the first time in days, I saw him relax. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine, soft and gentle. "Then let's do it," he whispered. "Let's get out of here." The next morning, we woke up early, packing our bags in a frenzy of excitement and fear. We didn't have a plan, didn't even know where we were going. All we knew was that we had to leave before my mom got back. It was reckless, impulsive, but it felt right. For the first time, we were taking control of our own lives, and it was exhilarating. As we loaded our bags into his car, I felt a mix of emotions: excitement, fear, hope. I didn't know what the future held, but as long as I was with him, I didn't care. We could figure it out together. But just as we were about to drive off, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway made us both freeze. I turned to see my mom's car pulling in, her face lighting up as she saw us. "Hey, I'm home early," she called, waving. My heart dropped. I hadn't expected her to come back so soon, and from the look on Jeff's face, neither had he. Panic surged through me. What were we supposed to do now? She got out of the car, walking over with a bright smile. "What's going on? Why are you both out here?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Jeff's hand tightened around mine, and I could feel him shaking. For a moment, we just stood there, caught between running away and facing the truth. "We were just," I started, but I couldn't finish the sentence. My mom's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing as she looked from me to Jeff, then back again. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice more serious now. I glanced at Jeff and he gave me a small nod, silently telling me it was okay. "Mom, there's something we need to tell you," I said, my voice shaking. "Something you're not going to like." The confusion on her face turned to concern and then to shock as I explained everything. I told her about the stolen moments, the nights we spent together, the love we'd tried to hide. With every word, I could see her face grow paler, her eyes filling with disbelief. By the time I finished, she looked like she was going to be sick. You're serious?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. "You're in love with my husband?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean for it to happen, but I love him." For a long time, she didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at us, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. And then, without warning, she slapped me across the face, hard enough to make me stumble back. "How could you?" she screamed, her voice raw with anger and hurt. "How could you do this to me?" I didn't know what to say. I'd hurt her, betrayed her, and there was nothing I could do to take it back. I wanted to apologize, to beg for her forgiveness, but I knew it wouldn't matter. The damage was done. Jeff stepped forward, trying to reach out to her, but she recoiled, like his touch burned her. "Please, let me explain." "Don't touch me," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I trusted you. I thought you loved me, and you betrayed me with my own son." The words stung, and I could see the pain in Jeff's eyes. "I do love you," he said, his voice breaking, "but I love him too. I'm sorry." She looked at him like she didn't even recognize him, then turned to me, her eyes filled with tears. "You both need to leave," she said, her voice cold and distant. "Get out of my house." For a moment, I thought about arguing, about trying to make her understand, but I knew it was pointless. We'd made our choice, and now we had to live with it. So I grabbed my bag, taking Jeff's hand, and together we walked to the car. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house, my heart aching. I knew I was leaving everything behind, my home, my family, the life I'd known. But when I looked at Jeff, I felt a sense of peace. I didn't know where we were going or what the future would bring, but I knew I wasn't alone, and that was enough.